Jack Miller, a single father and ex-military mechanic, struggles in rural Georgia to provide for his son, Eli. Despite his own leaky roof and mocking neighbor, Mr. McCarty, Jack stops to fix a stranger's broken truck for free. The mysterious elderly man watches silently as Jack works, his calm gaze hinting at hidden significance. The next morning, 3 black SUVs arrive, revealing the stranger as retired General Noah Caldwell. Why does a high-ranking military figure seek out Jack? What secrets did that truck hold? Stay tuned as Jack's simple act of kindness unravels a life-changing mystery. Love stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things? Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories. Your support helps us share inspiring tales like Jack's, where kindness transforms lives. Join our community, leave a comment about an act of kindness you've seen, and let's renew faith in humanity together. Hit that subscribe button. Jack Miller, a wiry 34-year-old with calloused hands and a heart weighed heavy by loss, knelt beside an old, battered truck on a dusty Georgia roadside. The late afternoon sun beat down, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, while his 4-year-old son, Eli, sat cross-legged on a patch of grass nearby, clutching a faded blue sippy cup. Jack's worn flannel shirt clung to his sweat-soaked back as he tightened a bolt, his fingers moving with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent years coaxing life back into stubborn machinery. His neighbor, a grizzled man named Tom, who lived 2 houses down, leaned against his mailbox, arms crossed, his face twisted into a sneer. "You're out here fixing some stranger's truck for free, Jack? Your own roof's leaking worse than a sieve and you're playing Good Samaritan?" The words dripped with mockery, but Jack only shrugged, his focus unwavering. He didn't have the energy to argue, not when Eli's wide, trusting eyes were watching him, and not when the quiet ache of doing something right pulsed softly in his chest. Jack's life hadn't always been this patchwork of odd jobs and small kindnesses. 5 years ago, he'd been Staff Sergeant Miller, a heavy-duty truck technician with the Third Infantry Division, his days filled with the hum of engines and the camaraderie of his unit. Back then, he and his high school sweetheart, Sarah, had built a life that felt like a dream they'd carefully stitched together. Sarah, with her quick laugh and knack for making algebra feel like a puzzle worth solving, had been the heart of their small community, her classroom a haven for teenagers who needed someone to believe in them. They'd married young, promising each other forever under a Georgia oak tree, and waited until their late 20s to bring Eli into the world, wanting to be sure they could give him everything. But forever had a way of slipping through their fingers. When Sarah first mentioned her bone-deep tiredness, they'd laughed it off as the toll of new motherhood. Late nights, early mornings, and a toddler who loved to test boundaries. But the fatigue lingered, then worsened, until a doctor's visit shattered their world with the words, "Stage 4. The cancer was a merciless thief, stealing Sarah's strength, her spark, and finally her life in just 11 months. Jack had held her hand through every chemo session, his heart fracturing with each failed treatment, knowing he'd soon be raising Eli alone. The military had been his anchor in those dark days. His commanding officer, a gruff but kind man, had pulled strings to keep Jack close to home during Sarah's illness, arranging reassignments and flexible hours. But after her funeral, when the weight of grief settled like dust on every corner of his life, Jack knew he couldn't be both the soldier the Army needed and the father Eli deserved. With an honorable discharge and a chest full of commendations for a decade of service, he stepped into civilian life, hoping to rebuild. But rural Georgia, battered by a recession, had little to offer a man with no college degree, even one who could rebuild an engine blindfolded. Companies wanted certifications Jack had never needed in the military, and full-time jobs with benefits were as rare as rain in August. So he cobbled together a living, fixing tractors for farmers, driving delivery runs for Henderson's Hardware, and lending a hand at his friend's auto shop when they were swamped. It was grueling, unsteady work, but it kept the lights on and food in the fridge. For Eli, Jack always managed a smile, even when the ache of unpaid bills and a leaking roof gnawed at him late at night. That day, as he drove home with Eli dozing in the back seat, Jack's eyes caught on the old truck slumped by the roadside. Its hood was propped open, and an elderly man in a mud-stained jacket stood beside it, his hands fumbling with tools he clearly didn't know how to use. Something about the scene tugged at Jack, a mix of instinct and the quiet pull of a man who'd never learned to walk away from someone in need. He pulled over, his old pickup creaking as he parked. "I've got a toolkit in the trunk," he called out, stepping toward the stranger. "Maybe I can lend a hand." The man looked up, his weathered face unreadable, and gave a slight nod. No name, no small talk, just a quiet acceptance. As Jack knelt to inspect the truck, he felt the man's eyes on him, steady and searching, not with the frantic impatience of most stranded drivers, but with a calm intensity, as if he were measuring Jack's every move. The problem was straightforward: corroded battery terminals and a misaligned timing belt. Nothing Jack's hands couldn't fix. But as he worked, a flicker of curiosity stirred in him. Who was this man, standing so still, watching so closely? And why did Jack feel in the pit of his stomach that this moment mattered more than he could yet understand? The next morning, the quiet of Jack's street was shattered by the rumble of 3 black SUVs pulling up to his modest, weather-beaten house. Their tinted windows and sleek official look sent a jolt through the neighborhood. Tom, the scoffing neighbor, stood frozen behind his curtain, his coffee mug forgotten in his hand, his earlier mockery replaced by a mix of awe and unease. Men in dark suits stepped out, their movements precise, their faces unreadable. They weren't here for trouble. They moved with purpose, like they'd come to honor someone. Jack stepped onto his porch, Eli clinging to his leg, his heart pounding with a mix of confusion and cautious hope. Who was that farmer? And why did these men, with their air of authority, look at Jack as if he'd just done something extraordinary? The truth, whatever it was, hung in the air like the Georgia heat, heavy with promise and mystery. The late afternoon sun hung low in the Georgia sky, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet rural road where Jack knelt beside a battered old pickup truck. His hands, calloused from years of hard work, moved with a steady, almost meditative precision as he tinkered with the engine. Jack's mind was sharp, analyzing each component with the focus of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not just from the humid air, but from the weight of his thoughts. Bills piling up, a roof that leaked worse with every storm, and the ever-present ache of providing for his son, Eli, alone. Yet, in this moment, he found a strange peace in the simple act of fixing something broken. It was a rare reprieve from the chaos of his life, a chance to lose himself in the rhythm of wrench and wire. A shadow fell across the truck as Mr. McCarty, Jack's neighbor, sauntered by, his boots crunching on the gravel. The older man's lips curled into a smirk, his voice dripping with mockery. "Well, ain't this a sight, out here slaving away for free for some backwoods nobody, when your own pipes are leaking like a sieve?" McCarty's chuckle was sharp, cutting through the still air. Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't look up. He knew McCarty's bitterness ran deep, rooted in the fact that Jack had bought the house McCarty's nephew had coveted years ago. To McCarty, Jack's every struggle, every unpaid bill, every patch on the roof was a personal victory, proof that Jack didn't deserve the home. The resentment was a living thing, festering in McCarty's heart, but Jack refused to feed it. He focused on the engine, letting the older man's words dissolve into the hum of cicadas. Inside the truck's cab, Eli sat cross-legged, his small frame barely filling the worn seat. His wide, bright eyes were fixed on his father, sparkling with a kind of hero worship that made Jack's chest ache. To Eli, Jack wasn't a man drowning in debt or haunted by loss. He was a giant, capable of fixing anything: trucks, hearts, the world. That look, so pure and unwavering, was a lifeline for Jack. It was worth more than any paycheck, more than the house he fought to keep, more than the pride that kept him from asking for help. Eli's admiration fueled him, a quiet reminder that he was doing something right, even when everything else felt wrong. It took nearly an hour of patient work before the truck's engine roared to life, a rough growl that smoothed into a steady purr. Jack wiped his hands on a rag, his shoulders relaxing for the first time that day. The old man who owned the truck, his face weathered like the Georgia clay, leaned out of the driver's window. His voice was gruff, but there was a weight to his words. "You never asked my name," he said, his eyes locking onto Jack's. "But I won't forget yours." Jack nodded, unsure how to respond. There was something in the man's gaze, gratitude, yes, but also a kind of recognition, as if he saw something in Jack that Jack himself had forgotten. The old man drove off, the truck kicking up dust, leaving Jack and Eli standing in the fading light. That night, Jack returned home late, his body heavy with exhaustion. The small house creaked under the weight of its years, mirroring Jack's own weariness. As he scrubbed his hands at the kitchen sink, the soap stinging the cuts on his knuckles, Eli's voice piped up from the table. "Dad, did you know who that guy was?" The boy's curiosity was boundless, his mind already spinning stories about the stranger. Jack smiled softly, drying his hands before ruffling Eli's hair. "Doesn't matter, buddy," he said, his voice warm but firm. "All that matters is he needed help." It was a truth Jack had carried since his days in the military, a lesson etched into his soul by his first sergeant. Back then, a young recruit with more bravado than sense, Jack had learned that you help your brothers in arms because they're in need, not because of who they are or where they come from. That principle had guided him through the chaos of service and stayed with him long after he'd traded his uniform for work boots. After tucking Eli into bed, Jack sat at the kitchen table, the dim light from the sink casting long shadows across the room. A stack of bills loomed before him, each envelope a reminder of his precarious reality. The electricity was overdue, the property taxes were looming, and the roof's leaks were spreading, mocking his efforts to keep the house together. Georgia's summer storms were relentless, and Jack knew they wouldn't pause for his bank account to recover. His mind drifted to his parents in Ohio, their kind faces flickering in his memory. They'd already helped with Sarah's funeral, a debt of gratitude that weighed heavier than any loan. At 34, Jack felt the sting of his own pride, the stubborn belief that he should be able to stand on his own. Asking for help felt like admitting defeat, and he wasn't ready to surrender. Exhaustion finally pulled him under, and he fell asleep on the couch, the soft chirping of crickets through the screen door mingling with the distant hum of highway traffic. It was a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of Sarah's laughter and Eli's future, both slipping through his fingers like sand. The next morning, Jack was in the kitchen pouring cereal for Eli when a cacophony of car horns shattered the quiet. Eli's spoon froze halfway to his mouth, milk dripping down his chin as he looked up, wide-eyed. "Daddy, someone's here," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. Jack wiped the boy's face with a napkin, a reflex born of countless mornings, and crossed to the window. What he saw stopped him cold. 3 sleek black SUVs were parked in front of the house, their polished surfaces glinting in the morning sun. Men in plain clothes stepped out, their movements precise, their postures unmistakable. Jack's years in the military had honed his ability to spot soldiers, even without uniforms. Their alertness, the way they scanned the yard, it screamed training. His heart kicked up a notch as he stepped onto the porch, his mind racing. Was this about his discharge? A glitch in his veteran's benefits? Or worse, was someone challenging his custody of Eli? Sarah's parents had long since accepted his role as Eli's guardian, but doubt gnawed at him. One of the men approached, his credentials flashing in the sunlight. "Lieutenant Colonel Wilson, sir," he said, his tone clipped but respectful. "We're with a high-ranking military personnel protection unit. Someone wants to meet you." Jack's pulse quickened, his thoughts at a whirlwind of possibilities. Before he could respond, the rear door of the central SUV opened and a tall figure emerged. Silver gray hair, a commanding presence, and a face Jack recognized instantly from newsreels and military briefings. Retired General Noah Caldwell, a legend in the armed forces. Jack's breath caught, his mind struggling to connect the dots. Why would a man like Caldwell be here, in his dusty front yard, seeking him out? The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, a mix of awe, confusion, and a faint flickering hope that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Jack Miller stood on the sagging porch of his modest home, the morning sun casting long shadows across the patchy lawn littered with his son Eli's toys. A plastic truck half buried in the grass, a deflated soccer ball, and a scattering of action figures weathered by countless imaginary battles. The peeling paint on the steps flaked under his work boots, a quiet reminder of the home repairs he hadn't had time or money to tackle. He adjusted his faded t-shirt, suddenly aware of its frayed hem as he faced the man before him. The stranger's piercing gaze carried an authority that snapped Jack's shoulders back, his spine straightening as if he were still a young recruit standing at attention. Old habits from his military days clung to him like a second skin, the muscle memory of discipline and respect for the chain of command as sharp now as it had been during basic training a decade ago. The man, Noah Caldwell, offered a faint smile, his weathered face softening just enough to ease the tension. "At ease, Miller," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of someone used to being heard. "I'm retired now, but I know what you did yesterday wasn't just about fixing a truck." Jack's brow creased slightly, his mind racing to recall the previous day's events. He'd helped a stranded driver on the side of a dusty road, a routine act of kindness he hadn't thought twice about. The truck's engine had sputtered out, and Jack, with his toolbox and years of mechanical know-how, had gotten it running again. He hadn't asked questions, hadn't needed to know who the man was. It was just what you did when someone needed help. Now, standing in front of this stranger who seemed to know him, Jack felt a flicker of curiosity tinged with unease. He stayed silent, his training kicking in. Wait for the senior officer to speak. Don't interrupt. Noah gestured toward Jack's home, his eyes scanning the modest structure without judgment. Mind if we talk inside? It's not classified, but it's best kept between us for now. Jack nodded, suddenly hyper-aware of the simplicity of his life laid bare. The chipped paint, the cluttered lawn, the faint creak of the porch underfoot. He led the way, holding the screen door open for Noah, who stepped inside with the quiet confidence of someone who'd walked into countless rooms and commanded them all. Inside, the living room was small but tidy, with a worn couch and a coffee table scarred from years of use. Eli, Jack's 6-year-old son, sat at the kitchen table, his cereal bowl forgotten as he stared wide-eyed at the visitor. The boy's dark hair fell into his eyes, and his small hands fidgeted with a spoon, his curiosity palpable. Noah's expression softened further as he crouched slightly to meet Eli's gaze. "You must be Eli," he said warmly, his voice carrying a grandfatherly gentleness that put the boy at ease. "Your dad helped me out yesterday when my truck broke down." Eli nodded solemnly, his young face serious as he processed the importance of the moment. "Daddy fixes lots of things," he said, his voice small but proud, a reflection of the unwavering trust he had in his father. Jack's chest tightened with a mix of pride and vulnerability. He wasn't used to his son's admiration being voiced in front of strangers, and it stirred a quiet ache in him, a reminder of how much Eli depended on him in a world that often felt stacked against them. "I bet he does," Noah replied, his smile lingering as he straightened and turned to Jack. "Could we speak privately for a moment?" Jack glanced at Eli, who was still staring at the visitor with a mix of awe and curiosity. "Hey, buddy," Jack said gently, ruffling his son's hair. "Why don't you go play in your room for a bit? We won't be long, I promise." Eli hesitated, his eyes flicking between his father and the stranger, but he nodded and slid off the chair, clutching his spoon like a talisman as he shuffled toward his room. Jack watched him go, a pang of guilt tugging at him for sending his son away, even for a moment. Eli was his world, the reason he got up every morning despite the bills piling up and the long hours at the garage that never seemed to stretch far enough. Once Eli's door clicked shut, Noah's demeanor shifted, the warmth giving way to a more serious, focused expression. He settled into a chair at the kitchen table, his hands clasped in front of him, exuding the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that mattered. "The truck you fixed yesterday," he began, his voice steady, "was mine. But what you didn't know was that it was carrying confidential files, documents being prepared for Congress about a fund to support veterans who've fallen on hard times." He paused, his eyes locking onto Jack's, searching for a reaction. Jack's mind churned, replaying the moment he'd knelt beside the truck, his hands greasy and his focus entirely on the engine. He hadn't noticed anything unusual, certainly not files that could sway policy in Washington. The weight of Noah's words settled over him, heavy with implications he wasn't sure he fully grasped. "I didn't want bodyguards tailing me," Noah continued, his tone measured but laced with conviction. "I wanted to see what life is really like for soldiers after they leave the service. Not the polished reports that make it to the Pentagon, but the raw, unfiltered truth." He gestured around the small kitchen, taking in the cracked linoleum, the second-hand fridge humming in the corner, the stack of unpaid bills tucked under a magnet. "You're living proof of what I've been trying to show them, Jack. A decorated veteran, skilled, honorable, and yet struggling to keep the lights on. It's not right. Jack's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and quiet frustration rising in his chest. He'd served his country with everything he had, earned in medals he kept in a drawer because they didn't pay the rent. And now this stranger was laying bare the reality he tried to shield from Eli. He opened his mouth to protest, but Noah raised a hand, his expression firm but not unkind. "This isn't about pity, Miller," Noah said, his voice cutting through Jack's discomfort. "It's about a system that's failing the people who gave it everything. I've spent the last year traveling, meeting veterans like you, seeing their lives up close. Not the stories that get sanitized for reports, but the real ones. The ones where men and women who served with courage come home to a country that doesn't know how to take care of them." Jack's throat tightened, the truth of Noah's words hitting harder than he expected. He thought of the nights he'd lain awake, worrying about Eli's future, wondering if he'd ever climb out of the hole of debt and dead-end jobs. He'd always told himself he was doing enough, that he was providing, but the cracks in that belief were starting to show. Noah reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. "This is an official thank you," he said, "but it's more than words." Jack opened the envelope, his hand steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Inside was an offer, a position with a nationwide veteran technician program. The salary was 3 times what he made at the garage, enough to cover the bills and more. There was housing assistance, a chance to move Eli into a better home, and tuition support for his son's education. Jack's breath caught as he read the details, the weight of possibilities settling over him like a warm blanket. It wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline, a chance to rebuild the life he'd been scraping together piece by piece. "We're launching a program to put veterans' skills to work," Noah explained, leaning forward slightly, his eyes bright with purpose. "Critical infrastructure, power grids, water systems, communications networks, the kind of work that keeps this country running but doesn't get noticed until it breaks. You've got the skills, Jack, and more importantly, you've got the heart. I saw it yesterday when you didn't hesitate to help a stranger. I told Congress years ago that we need to invest in people like you, not because you're struggling, but because you represent what's right in a world that too often forgets kindness." Noah's voice softened, a flicker of admiration in his gaze. "You ever help someone and find out later they weren't just anybody? That's what you did yesterday, Jack. You didn't know who I was, but you didn't need to. That's the kind of man we need." Jack sat back, the envelope still in his hands, his mind reeling. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope, but it was tempered by the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just about him. It was about Eli, about giving his son a future better than the one he'd had. He thought of the mom playing in his room, oblivious to the conversation that could change their lives. Jack's heart swelled with determination, but also with a quiet fear that this opportunity might be too good to be true. He looked at Noah, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "Sir, I don't know what to say. It's more than I could have hoped for." Noah smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through his serious demeanor. "You don't have to say anything, Miller. Just keep being the man you are. That's enough." As Noah stood to leave, Jack felt a shift in the air, like the world had tilted slightly toward possibility. He walked Noah to the door, his mind already racing with thoughts of what this could mean for Eli, for their future. The peeling paint, the scattered toys, the weight of the bills, they didn't feel so heavy anymore. For the first time in a long time, Jack Miller felt like he was standing on solid ground. Jack Miller stood in the cramped living room of his modest apartment, his heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. The faded wallpaper and worn-out couch seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment. Just 24 hours ago, he'd been hunched over a calculator, his brow furrowed as he tried to stretch his meager savings to cover next month's rent. The numbers hadn't added up, and the gnawing worry had kept him awake, staring at the ceiling, while his son, Eli, slept soundly in the next room. Now an unexpected visitor stood before him, a retired 4-star general no less, offering an opportunity that felt like it belonged in someone else's life. The envelope in Jack's hands trembled slightly, its contents still a mystery, as if opening it might shatter the surreal moment. I don't understand, sir, Jack said, his voice tinged with awe and suspicion. You're offering me a while just because I fixed your truck? General Caldwell, his posture still commanding, despite his civilian attire, gestured toward the small kitchen table tucked against the wall. Take a seat, Milo, he said, his tone warm, but carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who'd led thousands. Jack hesitated, then pulled out a chair, the wood groaning faintly under the general's weight, a subtle reminder of how out of place this distinguished figure seemed in Jack's humble world. The general's presence filled the room, not with arrogance, but with a quiet gravitas that made Jack's modest surroundings feel even smaller. Caldwell leaned back, his sharp eyes studying Jack with a mix of curiosity and respect. Let me give you some context, he began, his voice steady, but laced with a weariness that hinted at long battles fought, both on the battlefield and in boardrooms. For the last 18 months, I've been leading a congressional task force on veteran support services. Frankly, the results have been underwhelming. He paused, rubbing his temples, a fleeting crack in his composed demeanor that revealed the weight of his responsibilities. Reports, data, expert opinions, they tell us what's happening, but they don't explain why. So I decided to find out for myself. Jack listened intently, his fingers still clutching the unopened envelope, his mind racing to keep up. Caldwell explained how he'd spent months traveling across 5 states, shedding his title and security detail to blend in as just another face in the crowd. Sometimes a struggling veteran, sometimes a civilian down on his luck. That broken down truck you fixed yesterday? Caldwell said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't an accident. I've been staging these encounters, observing how people respond when they think no one important is watching. Jack's eyes widened, a mix of realization and unease washing over him. You were testing people, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper as the pieces fell into place. Observing, Caldwell corrected, his tone gentle but firm. In 14 staged breakdowns across 3 states, you were the only veterans who stopped without a second thought. Others drove past. Some demanded cash up front. One even recognized me and tried to parlay that into a job recommendation. The general leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Jack's. But you didn't even ask my name. You saw someone stranded, rolled up your sleeves and got to work. Then you refused payment. That's the kind of character we need. Jack's chest tightened, a swirl of emotions, pride, disbelief, and a flicker of self-doubt churning inside him. He'd always prided himself on doing the right thing, but he'd never thought it could lead to something like this. Caldwell's words carried weight, each one landing like a stone in the still waters of Jack's life, rippling out with possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. The general went on to describe the Veteran Technical Corps, a new pilot program designed to harness the skills of veterans with mechanical aptitude. It offered specialized training, followed by a placement in critical infrastructure roles across the country, jobs that came with stability, competitive pay, and educational benefits for dependents. We don't just need people who can fix machines, Caldwell said, his voice resolute. We need people who understand why things need fixing, people who see the bigger picture, who act with integrity even when no one's watching. Jack's mind spun as he tried to process the magnitude of the offer. This wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline, a chance to pull himself and Eli out of the constant struggle that had defined their lives since he'd left the service. But doubt crept in, whispering that he wasn't qualified, that he was just a small-town mechanic with grease-stained hands and no fancy degrees. Sir, he said, his voice faltering, I'm honored, truly, but I'm just a guy who knows his way around an engine. I don't have the advanced training or certifications you're probably looking for. Caldwell cut him off with a dismissive wave, his expression unwavering. We can teach skills, Miller. We can provide the training, the certifications, all of it. What we can't teach is character. You either have it or you don't, and you showed yours without knowing anyone was watching. That's rarer than any degree. The general reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek folder, sliding it across the table. Jack's hands, still calloused from years of wrench turning, hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were pages detailing the program, training schedules, compensation packages, housing options, and benefits that could secure a future for Eli. College, stability, a life beyond scraping by. As Jack scanned the documents, the reality of what was being offered began to sink in, heavy and exhilarating. All at once, his thoughts drifted to Eli, his 10-year-old son, who deserves so much more than the uncertainty Jack had been able to provide. "This would change everything for Eli and me," he murmured, almost to himself, his voice thick with emotion. Caldwell nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "That's the idea, Millers," he said. "Men like you served your country with honor. Now it's time for your country to return the favor." Jack sat back, the folder still open in front of him, his heart swelling with a cautious hope he hadn't felt in years. The weight of his struggles, late-night bills, the fear of failing Eli, the quiet shame of never quite getting ahead, seemed to lift, if only for a moment. He thought of the truck, the simple act of stopping to help a stranger, and how that small choice had led to this. Caldwell watched him, his expression softening, as if he could see the gears turning in Jack's mind. "Take your time," the general said, standing to leave. "Read through the details. Talk it over with your boy. But I have a feeling you already know what you're going to do." As the door closed behind Caldwell, Jack sat alone at the table, the envelope and folder before him, his mind alight with the promise of a new beginning. Jack Miller sat in the dim light of his cramped living room, the weight of the morning's conversation pressing heavily on his chest. The worn couch creaked beneath him as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the scuffed coffee table where a single business card lay like a ticket to a different life. His calloused fingers traced the edges of the card, the embossed name, General Caldwell, stirring a mix of pride and unease. The general's words echoed in his mind. "You served your country once, Miller. Now we're asking you to serve again, with the respect and pay you deserve." The promise was tempting, but it came with a challenge, uprooting the fragile stability he'd built for himself and his 4-year-old son Eli. Jack's hazel eyes, shadowed by years of hard work and harder choices, flicked toward the hallway where Eli slept, his small form tucked under a second-hand quilt. What would this mean for them? Could he really trade the familiarity of their small, leaky rental for a chance at something better? The morning had started like any other, with Jack sipping bitter coffee and scanning job listings on his cracked phone screen. Then came the knock, sharp, authoritative, unlike the casual raps of neighbors. He'd opened the door to find General Caldwell, a man whose presence filled the room with quiet command. His pressed suit and polished shoes stood out against the peeling paint of Jack's porch, and the black SUVs parked outside had drawn every eye in the neighborhood. Caldwell's offer was clear: a government program to train skilled veterans like Jack for critical infrastructure jobs, electrical grids, water systems, the backbone of the nation. 6 months in Atlanta, Caldwell had said, standing tall as he outlined the deal. Home on weekends, then a permanent posting near your son. Think it over, Miller. 48 hours. Jack had nodded, his throat tight, unsure if the warmth in his chest was hope or fear. As Caldwell spoke, Jack's mind had wandered to the past. He'd been a mechanic in the Army, fixing Humvees under desert suns, his hands always stained with grease and pride. But civilian life hadn't been kind. The odd jobs he scraped together, car repairs, plumbing gigs, whatever paid, barely covered rent. Medical bills from Eli's ear infections lingered like ghosts, and the ceiling's water stains seemed to mock his efforts to keep their heads above water. Caldwell's offer felt like a lifeline, but Jack couldn't shake the doubt gnawing at him. What if he failed the training? What if the job took him too far from Eli, who needed his dad more than ever since his mom left? The thought of letting his son down twisted like a knife in his gut. Outside, the SUVs had turned the quiet street into a spectacle. Jack had caught sight of Mr. McCarty, his nosy neighbor, lingering on his porch, mailbox open, but eyes fixed on the vehicles. Others followed suit, Mrs. Larson watering her already soaked roses, kids pausing their bike races to gawk. The neighborhood's curiosity buzzed like static, and Jack felt exposed, as if his private struggles were on display. When Caldwell finally stood to leave, he pressed the business card into Jack's hand, his grip firm but not unkind. Monday, 8 o'clock a.m. Georgia Regional Office, bring your tools, Miller. First day's a practical test. The general's parting words lingered as the convoy rolled away, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts. That evening, Jack sat at the kitchen table, a chipped mug of cold coffee forgotten beside him. Eli clambered onto his lap, his small hands clutching a toy truck. "Were those men soldiers like you, Dad?" he asked, his wide blue eyes bright with curiosity. Jack's heart swelled at the question, his son's innocence a balm against the day's weight. "Kinda, buddy. The man who came here, he was a big deal soldier once, a general." Eli's face lit up. "The one whose truck you fixed?" Jack chuckled, ruffling Eli's sandy hair, amazed at how his son's sharp mind pieced things together. "Yeah, that's him." Eli tilted his head, his expression shifting to something deeper, almost wary. "Is he your friend now?" Jack hesitated, the word friend feeling too simple for the complex mix of gratitude and obligation he felt toward Caldwell. "Not exactly, little man, but he thinks he can help us out." Eli's next question came softer, tinged with the uncertainty of a child who'd already known too much change. "Are we moving, Dad?" Jack's gaze swept the room. The sagging couch, the thrift store toys lined neatly on a shelf, the ceiling's brown stains spreading like doubt. "Maybe," he said, his voice thick. "Would that be okay with you?" Eli's brow furrowed, his small face scrunching in thought. Jack watched, marveling at the gravity his son brought to the question, as if the fate of their little world rested on his answer. After a long pause, Eli asked, "Will you still fix things?" Jack's smile broke through, warm and steady. "Always, buddy. Just maybe bigger things, with better money." Eli nodded, his decision made with the unshakable logic of childhood. "Then it's okay." Jack pulled him close, breathing in the scent of shampoo and crayons, vowing silently to make this work. For Eli. For them both. Later, as the sun dipped low, Jack knelt beside his pickup, changing the oil with practiced ease. The task felt small, almost trivial, after the morning's upheaval. Footsteps crunched on gravel, and Jack glanced up to see Mr. McCarty approaching, his usual swagger softened by curiosity. "Government vehicles, huh?" he said, leaning against the truck, his tone hovering between question and statement. Jack nodded, focusing on the oil filter. "General Caldwell offered me a job." McCarty's face flickered, disbelief, then a grudging respect. "What, 'cause you fixed his truck?" "Gotta be more to it than that." Jack tightened the filter, his movements deliberate. He thought back to the day before, when he'd stopped to help a stranded driver on the highway, not knowing the man was a retired general. McCarty had scoffed then, calling Jack a sucker for wasting time on strangers. Now Jack met his neighbor's eyes, his voice low but firm. "I didn't fix his truck. I fixed a guy's truck. Turns out it's not about who they are, it's about what they need." McCarty shifted, his discomfort plain, likely recalling his own harsh words. "Well," he muttered, "good for you, I suppose." He walked off, leaving Jack to finish his work, the hum of possibility settling over him. By nightfall, Jack's decision was made. He didn't need the full 48 hours. After tucking Eli into bed, he dialed the number on Caldwell's card, his voice steady as he confirmed his interest. The regional office emailed paperwork, and Jack filled it out under the flicker of a kitchen bulb. The salary, triple his current patchwork income, felt like a dream. Full medical coverage meant Eli's doctor visits wouldn't haunt their budget. As he signed the final form, Jack's chest loosened, hope edging out fear. For the first time in years, he saw a future where he could be more than a man scraping by, a father who could give his son the life he deserved. Jack sat at the worn kitchen table, the weight of the pen heavy in his calloused hand as he scrawled his signature across the final page of the contract. His heart thumped with a mix of disbelief and cautious hope, emotions he hadn't felt so fiercely since his days in the military. The Veteran Technical Corps had offered him not just a job, but a lifeline, a housing allowance that promised a move to a safer neighborhood, where Eli could attend a school with green lawns and books that weren't tattered at the edges. It felt like stumbling into a stroke of fortune he hadn't dared to dream of, as if the universe had finally noticed him, truly seen in him for the first time since he'd hung up his uniform. His chest swelled with gratitude, but beneath it lingered a quiet fear. What if this was too good to last? What if he failed Eli in this new chapter? That Sunday, Jack loaded their sparse belongings into the bed of his old pickup truck. Eli's toys, a handful of mismatched action figures and a well-loved stuffed bear, sat in a cardboard box next to Jack's toolbox, its contents worn but meticulously organized. A small wooden box held photos of his late wife, Sarah, her smile frozen in time, a reminder of love and loss that still caught him off guard on quiet nights. As he tied down the load, Jack's gaze lingered on the meager pile. It wasn't much to show for years of struggle, but as he glanced at Eli, chasing a stray leaf across the yard with the grin, he felt a spark of possibility. Maybe this move wasn't just about a new address, maybe it was the start of something bigger, something that could rewrite their story. Jack had never been one for the spotlight, so when the local news station called, asking him to share his story on air, he declined with a polite but firm shake of his head. "I just fixed a truck," he said, his voice steady but soft. "Not to be remembered, but because someone once fixed mine when I was still in uniform." His mind drifted to a sun-scorched day during his deployment, when his vehicle had sputtered to a stop near a remote village. A local mechanic, face lined with years of hard work, had spent hours under the blistering sun, coaxing the engine back to life. When Jack tried to pay him, the man waved him off, his eyes crinkling with a quiet wisdom. "A man who fixes things carries peace in his hands," he'd said. Those words had rooted themselves in Jack's soul, shaping how he faced life's broken pieces, whether it was a carburetor or his own fractured dreams. That simple act of kindness had taught him that fixing things wasn't just about tools. It was about restoring hope, one small act at a time. In the diner near their new home, a photograph hung in a simple wooden frame, capturing a moment that had changed everything. There was Jack, his work-worn hands resting on Eli's shoulders, the boy's eyes bright with pride. Behind them stood 3 SUVs, their polished surfaces gleaming in the sunlight, a testament to the pride that had sparked this new beginning. Below the photo, an inscription read, "One father, one right action, one life lesson for the next generation." The diner's owner, a Vietnam veteran with a gruff voice and a heart as big as the sky, had insisted on hanging the photo after hearing Jack's story. To him, it was a beacon of what mattered in a world obsessed with wealth and status. He'd point to it while pouring coffee for regulars, saying, "This here's proof that character still counts." Jack would blush and look away, uncomfortable with the attention, but warmed by the sentiment. To him, the photo wasn't about glory. It was a reminder of the moment he'd chosen to do what was right, not for praise, but because it was who he was. Eli, now 6, had settled into their new life with the resilience only a child could muster. The new school, with its small classes and teachers who knew every student's name, was a far cry from the overcrowded classrooms of their old neighborhood. Eli had lost his mother too young, and the grief still lingered in the quiet moments. But here he had space to grow. His teacher, Miss Harper, marveled at his maturity, the way he carried himself with a quiet strength that belied his years. During a class discussion about parents' jobs, Eli's answer had left his classmates wide-eyed. "My dad makes good people," he'd said, his voice clear and proud. When Ms. Harper shared this with Jack at the parent-teacher conference, he had felt a lump rise in his throat. He smiled, his eyes tracing the grain of the table, and thought of how Eli saw the world, uncluttered by cynicism, untouched by the metrics adults use to measure worth. To Eli, Jack wasn't just a mechanic. He was a builder of something greater, a shaper of lives. A year later, Jack had found his place in the Veteran Technical Corps. His hands-on expertise and calm, steady leadership had earned him a role training new recruits, veterans like him, searching for purpose after the structure of military life had faded. He poured himself into the work, guiding them through the intricacies of engines and circuits, but also teaching them to carry themselves with the same quiet dignity he'd learned from that village mechanic years ago. The program had grown beyond its original vision, forging partnerships with technical colleges to offer certifications and launching apprenticeship programs in communities where veterans often struggled to find their footing. Jack's desk, cluttered with manuals and coffee mugs, held 2 photographs that anchored him. One was from that day in Caldwell, a snapshot of a moment that had changed his life. The other was newer, Eli, on his first day of kindergarten, standing in front of their new home, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his grin wide-eyed and fearless. The house was modest but sturdy, with no leaky roof or creaking floors, just a foundation for stability and dreams. On weekends, Jack and Eli would sometimes drive back to their old neighborhood, not out of longing for the pound, but to keep their roots close. They'd stop by Mrs. Keller's house, dropping off a bag of groceries or raking leaves from her overgrown yard. The old woman's face would light up, her hands trembling as she offered them lemonade, her gratitude wrapping around Jack like a warm blanket. Even McCarty, the gruff neighbor who'd once mocked Jack's quiet kindness, received occasional visits. Jack would bring a spare part from McCarty's ancient lawnmower or help patch a fence, never mentioning the past slights. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about living the philosophy that had carried him through, fixing what was broken, carrying peace in his hands. Each visit was a reminder to Eli and to himself of the journey they'd taken, from a life of scraping by to one of purpose and possibility. The conversations between Jack Miller and his young son Eli often felt stilted, carrying a weight that neither could fully articulate. Their words stumbled over unspoken hurts and lingering uncertainties, especially after long days spent helping others in their small community. One chilly afternoon, after they'd wrestled with a rusted water heater in the cramped basement of Mr. McCarty's home, Eli's curiosity broke through. "Dad, why do we keep helping Mr. McCarty when he's been so cruel to you?" His voice was soft but pointed, his brow furrowed with a mix of confusion and indignation. The memory of McCarty's sharp words, snapped at Jack years ago over a trivial property line dispute, hung in the air like a shadow. Jack paused, his hands still greasy from the repair, and looked at his son. The question stirred something deep within him, a churn of emotions he hadn't fully sorted out himself. He thought about the sting of McCarty's insults, the way they'd made him feel small in front of his neighbors. But he also thought about the man he wanted to be, the father he hoped Eli would look up to. After a long breath, he knelt to meet Eli's gaze. "Helping others isn't about whether they've earned it, buddy," he said, his voice steady but warm. "It's about deciding who we want to be in this world. I want us to be the kind of people who show up no matter what." Eli nodded slowly, his young mind grappling with the idea, though Jack could see the spark of understanding in his son's eyes. Inside, Jack felt a quiet pride, hoping he was planting a seed that would grow into something lasting. When the local Knights of Resilience newsletter featured Jack in their quarterly issue, they asked him a question that caught him off guard. Out of all the tools in his well-stocked garage, wrenches, drills, saws, what did he consider the most essential? Jack didn't hesitate. "Perspective," he said, his voice firm, but tinged with humility. He explained that perspective was the lens that turned obstacles into possibilities. An inconvenience, like a flat tire or a stranger stranded on the highway, could be a door to something greater. That person on the side of the road, he added, might just be carrying the answer to a prayer you haven't even thought to say yet. His words struck a chord, and the article spread like wildfire through veteran communities across the state. Jack's inbox began to fill with messages from former service members, men and women who saw their own struggles reflected in his story. They wrote of their frustrations, their skills honed in the military but left unused in civilian life, their sense of purpose dulled by a world that didn't seem to need them. Each email weighed on Jack, not with burden, but with a quiet resolve to keep going, to show others that their skills and their hearts still mattered. The story caught the attention of General Caldwell, a retired officer now serving as a special advisor to the President on Veteran Affairs. Caldwell had met Jack years earlier, though Jack didn't know it at the time. The general had been the stranded motorist Jack stopped to help on a rain-soaked back road, a test of character disguised as a broken-down truck. Caldwell never forgot that moment, and he began weaving Jack's story into his congressional testimonies. "We spend billions on tanks, jets, and satellites to measure military readiness," he told a hushed committee room, his voice thick with conviction. "But the true strength of this nation lies in the hearts of people like Jack Miller. People who do what's right, not because they'll get something out of it, but because it's who they are." Caldwell's words carried weight, And soon, the technical core model that had given Jack a new start, a program built on selecting skilled veterans for their character first, then training them for civilian trades, began to expand. New programs sprang up, tailored to fields like healthcare, education, and emergency management, each rooted in the same principle: character above all else. Back in Jack's neighborhood, something unexpected arrived in the mail that first winter after the newsletter article. It was a Christmas card from Mr. McCarty, the same man who'd once spat venom over a fence line. Jack opened it with a mix of curiosity and caution, half expecting a grudging acknowledgement. Instead, the note inside was brief but raw. "You showed me I was seeing the world all wrong. Thank you for that." Jack stood in his kitchen, the card in his hand, feeling a wave of emotions he couldn't quite name. There was no pride in it, only a quiet awe at the possibility of change, even in someone as stubborn as McCarty. He tucked the card into a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that hearts could shift, that kindness could crack even the hardest walls. On quiet evenings, after Eli was tucked into bed, Jack would sit on the porch of their modest new home, the one they'd earned through his work with the program. The night air was cool, and his thoughts wandered to the strange chain of events that had reshaped their lives. The broken-down truck, the general's test, the opportunities that came not from seeking reward but from giving without expectation. He wondered how many other moments like that passed people by every day, disguised as annoyances, ignored in the rush of life. How many chances to change a life, or have your own changed, were left on the roadside because no one stopped to help? Jack's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. He thought of Eli, asleep upstairs, and hoped his son would grow up seeing the world through that same lens of possibility. He thought of the veterans who'd written to him, their words heavy with hope and hunger for a second chance. And he thought of McCarty, a man who'd once seemed unreachable, now humbled by a lesson Jack hadn't even meant to teach. As the stars blinked above, Jack felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. The smallest acts, done with the right heart, could ripple further than anyone could imagine.